David nodded and turned to his son. "Kevin, why don't you help Tommy finish that last corner of the puzzle? We'll be right back." The two men walked out into the hallway, leaving the boys to continue their work. Robert closed the game room door behind them and faced David. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. "Look, Mr. Whitmore," David began, his voice steady but respectful. "I know how this must look. I've been working for you for 2 years, and I've never brought Kevin to work before. My sitter, Mrs. Chen, she's been watching him after school since my wife got sick. But this morning she called and said she had the flu. I couldn't leave Kevin alone, and I couldn't afford to miss another day of work." Robert crossed his arms, still processing what he'd witnessed. "You could have called me. Asked permission?" "You're right, I should have," David admitted. "But you were in Chicago for those important meetings. I didn't want to bother you with my personal problems. I figured I'd keep Kevin outside with me, working on the gardens. But when we were trimming the hedges near the game room window, Tommy saw us and came outside in his wheelchair." David paused, running a hand through his hair. "Tommy looked so lonely, Mr. Whitmore. He asked if Kevin wanted to see his puzzle collection. I know I should have said no, but—" "But what?" Robert asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "But your son hasn't had a friend over to this house in the entire 2 years I've worked here," David said quietly. "He spends most afternoons alone, in that room, and when I'm working in the garden, I can see him through the window sometimes. He just sits there, staring outside, looking like he's waiting for someone who never comes." The words stung because Robert knew they were true. Since the divorce, Tommy's social life had completely disappeared. His ex-wife had taken Tommy to most of his social activities, and when she moved across town, those connections were lost. Robert had been so busy trying to rebuild his business after the divorce settlement that he hadn't thought about rebuilding Tommy's social life too. "So you decided to bring your son inside my house without asking," Robert said, but his anger was starting to fade, replaced by something that felt uncomfortably like shame. "I made a judgment call," David said firmly, "and I'd make the same call again." Those boys connected instantly. Kevin doesn't see Tommy's wheelchair or his challenges. He just sees another kid who likes puzzles and space. "When was the last time your son laughed like he was laughing in there?" Robert opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He couldn't remember. David continued, his voice gentle but direct. "Tommy told Kevin that kids at school call him the robot boy because of the way he walks with his braces. He said some kids make beeping sounds when he passes them in the hallways. Mr. Whitmore, your son thinks there's something wrong with him." "There's nothing wrong with Tommy," Robert said quickly, defensively. "I know that. Kevin knows that." "But does Tommy know that?" David asked. "Because from what I've seen today, he's carrying a lot of pain that he's not sharing with anyone." Robert leaned against the wall, feeling suddenly exhausted. "His mother and I? We've been so focused on the divorce proceedings, on dividing assets, on custody schedules. Maybe we haven't been paying enough attention to how all this change has affected him." "Tommy mentioned that he doesn't see his mom as much anymore," David said carefully. "He said she's busy with her new job and her new apartment." Robert's jaw tightened. His ex-wife Linda had indeed thrown herself into her career after their separation, claiming she needed to find herself after 15 years of marriage. Their custody arrangement gave her every other weekend and 1 weeknight, but she'd canceled the last 3 visits due to work commitments. "You don't understand the situation," Robert said. "You're right, I don't," David agreed. "But I understand what it's like to be a father working multiple jobs, trying to hold everything together while your family faces challenges." Something in David's tone made Robert look at him more closely. "Multiple jobs?" David nodded. "I work here 3 days a week maintaining your grounds. Tuesday and Thursday I work for a landscaping company. Friday through Sunday I work at a hardware store. My wife Helen has been undergoing cancer treatment for the past 8 months, and even with insurance, the medical bills are He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about my problems. Robert felt his perspective shifting. He'd never thought about David's life beyond the work he did on the estate. He'd never asked about David's family. Never. Wondered why he sometimes looked tired or distracted. David was just the groundskeeper, a reliable, quiet presence who kept the property looking perfect. Your wife has cancer? Robert asked. Breast cancer. She's responding well to treatment, but she can't work right now. Used to be a teacher just like I was before the school budget cuts. David's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. Kevin spends a lot of time at the hospital with her, or with sitters when I'm working. Today was just one of those days when plans fell through. You were a teacher? Robert asked, surprised. Special education, David replied. Worked with kids who had learning differences, physical challenges, autism. Loved that job. But when the district cut funding, teachers like me were the first to go. He paused. That's probably why I recognized some things about Tommy that you might not have noticed. What things? David chose his words carefully. Tommy is incredibly intelligent, Mr. Whitmore. But he processes information differently than other kids. He needs more time to work through problems. But when he gets there, his solutions are often more creative than what typical kids come up with. That puzzle in there? Most 12-year-olds would have given up after 20 minutes. Tommy stayed with it for over an hour because Kevin showed him how to break it down into smaller, manageable pieces. Robert thought about all the times he'd seen Tommy struggle with homework, all the times he'd gotten frustrated watching his son work so slowly through assignments that seemed simple. He'd attributed it to Tommy's disabilities, never considering that Tommy might just need a different approach. The kids at school, Robert said slowly, they really call him Robot Boy? According to Tommy, yes. And apparently some of the teachers don't understand his needs either. He mentioned that his math teacher gets impatient when he needs extra time on tests, and his PE teacher makes him sit on the sidelines during most activities instead of finding ways to include him. Anger flared in Robert's chest, but this time it wasn't directed at David. Why hasn't he told me any of this? Has he had the chance? David asked gently. When you get home from work, do you ask him about his day? Do you sit down and really listen to his answers? The question hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Most evenings he came home exhausted, checked that Tommy had done his homework, made sure he'd eaten dinner, and then retreated to his home office to catch up on work emails. Their conversations were usually limited to logistics. What time was his therapy appointment? Had he taken his medications? Did he need any supplies for school? I thought I was being a good father by providing for him, Robert said quietly. The big house, the best schools, private therapists, all the medical equipment he needs. You are providing for him, David said. But kids need more than just material things. They need to feel understood, valued, connected to other people. Tommy is hungry for that kind of connection, Mr. Whitmore. Today, for just a couple of hours, he got to experience what it feels like to have a friend who accepts him exactly as he is. From inside the game room, they could hear the boys celebrating. We did it! Tommy's voice called out. Kevin, we actually finished it! I told you we could do it, Kevin responded. You're really good at puzzles, Tommy. Way better than me at the space parts. Robert felt his throat tighten as he listened to his son's genuine happiness. When was the last time he'd heard Tommy sound so proud of himself? When was the last time anyone had told Tommy he was good at something? Mr. Whitmore, David said softly, I'm not trying to overstep my boundaries or tell you how to parent your son. But if you're open to it, I'd like to help. Not as your employee, but as someone who understands what Tommy needs and wants to see him succeed. Robert looked at this man who worked 3 jobs to support his sick wife and young son, who had recognized Tommy's loneliness and done something about it, who had given Tommy more encouragement in one afternoon than Robert had provided in months. What are you suggesting? Robert asked. Before David could answer, the game room door burst open and both boys came rushing out, Kevin pushing Tommy's wheelchair at a speed that would have terrified most adults. "Dad! Mr. Whitmore!" Tommy called excitedly. "You have to come see! We finished the whole solar system, and David was right. We found Saturn and all its rings, and Jupiter with the big red spot, and everything." Looking at his son's glowing face, Robert realized that whatever David was about to propose, he was ready to listen. The black Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway of the grand Whitmore mansion 3 hours earlier than expected. Robert Whitmore turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, rubbing his tired eyes. The business trip to Chicago had been a disaster. 3 days of meetings, canceled deals, and disappointing presentations. All he wanted now was a quiet evening with his son, Tommy. Robert grabbed his leather briefcase and walked toward the massive front door. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Everything looked exactly as it should, the hedges trimmed to perfection, the flowers in neat rows, the marble fountain bubbling peacefully. His groundskeeper David really did excellent work. But something was different today. As Robert approached the front steps, he heard voices coming from inside the house. Not just one voice, multiple voices. His heart rate quickened. Tommy should be alone right now. The nanny had been let go 2 months ago after the divorce settlement, and Robert's ex-wife wasn't supposed to pick up Tommy until Sunday. Robert quietly inserted his key and pushed open the heavy oak door. The voices were clearer now, coming from the game room at the end of the hallway. One was definitely Tommy's voice, but there were others too. Adult voices. A child's laughter that wasn't Tommy's. Fear gripped Robert's chest. Who was in his house? Were they robbers? Had something happened to Tommy? He pulled out his phone, ready to call 911, and crept down the marble hallway toward the game room. The door was slightly open, and what Robert saw through the crack made him stop in his tracks. His 12-year-old son, Tommy, was sitting on the carpet, his wheelchair folded nearby. Next to him sat a young black boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, patiently helping Tommy arrange colorful puzzle pieces. And standing near the window, pointing up at something outside, was David, his groundskeeper. "You see that bright star right there, boys?" David was saying in a gentle voice. "That's actually not a star at all. That's Venus, one of the planets, in our solar system." Tommy looked up from his puzzle, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? It looks like a star to me?" "That's what most people think," David smiled. "But planets reflect light from the sun, while stars make their own light. Venus is so bright because it's covered in thick clouds that bounce sunlight back to us." The other boy, who Robert assumed must be David's son, raised his hand like he was in school. "Mr. David, why can't we see the other planets?" "Oh, but we can. You just have to know when and where to look. Mars looks like a tiny red dot, and Jupiter is so big that on really clear nights you can see it without any telescope at all." Robert stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. What was David doing in his house? Why had he brought his child to work? This was completely inappropriate. He was about to storm in and demand an explanation when Tommy spoke up. "I wish I could see all the planets," Tommy said softly. "The kids at school say I'm weird because I like space stuff. They say only baby kids like looking at stars." Robert's chest tightened. He had no idea Tommy was being teased at school. When had his son mentioned liking astronomy? Robert couldn't remember a single conversation about planets or stars. David knelt down beside Tommy, his voice kind but firm. "Listen to me, Tommy. There's nothing weird about loving space. Some of the smartest people in the world are astronomers. And you know what? Being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of." "But they laugh at me," Tommy whispered, his hands fidgeting with his puzzle pieces. "They say I'm slow because I can't walk fast and because sometimes I need help understanding things." Robert felt his heart breaking. How long had Tommy been carrying this pain alone? David's son looked at Tommy with serious eyes. My dad always tells me that people who make fun of others are usually just scared or sad about something in their own lives. You're not slow, Tommy. You just think about things differently than other kids. That's actually pretty cool. Really? Tommy asked, a small smile appearing on his face. Really, David confirmed. Some of the greatest scientists and inventors in history thought differently than everyone else. That's exactly what made them special. Robert watched his son's face light up in a way he hadn't seen in months. When was the last time he had seen Tommy smile like that? When was the last time he had sat on the floor and just talked with his son about things Tommy cared about? David walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a thick book about space. Tell you what, if your dad says it's okay, maybe I can show you and Kevin here some more constellations this weekend. There's going to be a meteor shower on Saturday night. What's a meteor shower? Tommy asked excitedly. It's like nature's own fireworks show, David explained, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with the two boys. Tiny pieces of space rock burn up in our atmosphere and create streaks of light across the sky. Some people call them shooting stars. Kevin, David's son, leaned forward with interest. Can you really make a wish on them? David chuckled. Well, that's just an old tradition. But I like to think that when we look up at the stars, it reminds us how big and amazing the universe is and how lucky we are to be part of it. Tommy nodded, thoughtfully. I never thought about it like that before. Robert realized he was still standing in the hallway like an intruder in his own home. These three had been having the most meaningful conversation Tommy had probably heard all week, and Robert had been completely absent from his son's life. Again. Dad? Tommy's voice suddenly called out. Is that you? Robert had no choice but to step into the room. David immediately stood up, a look of worry crossing his face. Kevin moved closer to his father, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Mr. Whitmore, David said quickly, I can explain. My regular babysitter got sick today, and I couldn't afford to miss work. I brought Kevin with me, and Tommy asked if we wanted to see his game room. I'm sorry if I overstepped any boundaries. Robert looked at his son, who was still sitting on the carpet, his puzzle half finished. Tommy's expression had changed from joy to fear, as if he was afraid he had gotten his friends in trouble. We weren't doing anything bad, Dad, Tommy said, quickly. David was just teaching us about planets and stars, and Kevin helped me with this really hard puzzle. Look, we almost finished it. Robert looked down at the puzzle. It was a detailed map of the solar system, with hundreds of tiny pieces. Tommy usually gave up on puzzles after a few minutes, claiming they were too frustrating. But here he was, nearly finished with one of the most complex puzzles Robert had ever seen. How long have you been working on this? Robert asked, his voice softer than he intended. About an hour, Tommy said proudly. Kevin showed me a trick about looking for the edge pieces first, and David helped us identify all the different planets. Did you know that Saturn has more than 80 moons? Robert shook his head slowly. He hadn't known that. In fact, he realized he knew very little about what his son was interested in these days. Between work meetings, phone calls, and dealing with the divorce paperwork, Robert had been running on autopilot for months. David cleared his throat gently. Mr. Whitmore, I want to apologize again. This won't happen in the future. I'll make other arrangements for Kevin when my sitter isn't available. No, Tommy said suddenly, struggling to push himself up from the carpet. Please don't say Kevin. Can't come back. He's the first kid who didn't treat me like I was stupid or broken. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. His son felt stupid and broken? How had he missed this? How had he been so focused on his own problems that he hadn't noticed his child was struggling with loneliness and self-doubt? Robert looked at David, really looked at him for the first time since hiring him 2 years ago. He saw tired eyes, work-worn, hands, and genuine concern for Tommy's feelings. This man had done more for his son in one afternoon than Robert had done in weeks. David, Robert said finally, can we talk privately for a minute? Robert looked at his son's beaming face and felt something shift inside his chest. Tommy was practically glowing with pride and excitement, emotions Robert hadn't seen from him in months. The transformation was remarkable. Just that morning, Tommy had been the quiet, withdrawn boy who barely spoke at breakfast. Now he was animated, confident, eager to share his accomplishments. "Show me this masterpiece," Robert said, managing a genuine smile. The four of them crowded back into the game room, where the completed puzzle covered most of the coffee table. It was indeed impressive, a detailed map of the solar system with each planet clearly visible, surrounded by stars and cosmic dust. But what struck Robert most wasn't the puzzle itself. It was the way Tommy moved around it, pointing out different features with the confidence of someone who truly understood what he was looking at. "See this part here, Dad?" Tommy said, his finger tracing the rings around Saturn. "David taught us that Saturn isn't the only planet with rings. Jupiter has them too, but they're so thin you can barely see them. And look at this. Kevin helped me find all the pieces that make up the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter." Kevin nodded enthusiastically. "Tommy knows so much cool stuff about space. Did you know that one day on Venus is longer than 1 year on Venus? That sounds impossible, but Tommy explained it to me." Robert looked at his son with new eyes. When had Tommy learned so much about astronomy? How had he missed this passion completely? "That's amazing, guys," Robert said. "This must have taken hours to complete." 3 hours and 22 minutes, Tommy said proudly. "We timed it. Kevin said it's important to celebrate how long you work on something difficult, not just whether you finish it." David caught Robert's eye and nodded slightly. This was exactly the kind of thinking that Tommy needed, focusing on effort and persistence rather than just results. After the boys had shown off every detail of their puzzle, David suggested it was time for him and Kevin to head home. "Kevin has homework to finish, and it's getting close to dinner time." "Can Kevin come back tomorrow?" Tommy asked hopefully. "We could work on my telescope. I haven't been able to figure out how to use it properly." Robert remembered buying that expensive telescope for Tommy's birthday 6 months ago. It had been gathering dust in the corner of the game room ever since, another well-intentioned gift that had missed the mark because Robert hadn't taken the time to help Tommy learn how to use it. "We'll see," Robert said. "David and I need to talk about some things first." After David and Kevin left, Robert and Tommy sat down for dinner together, something that happened rarely enough that Tommy seemed surprised by the arrangement. Usually, Tommy ate earlier with whatever caregiver was available, and Robert grabbed something later while working in his office. "Tommy," Robert began carefully, "tell me about school. How are things going with your classmates?" Tommy's expression immediately changed, the joy from the afternoon fading into something guarded. "School's okay, I guess." "Just okay? Are you making friends? Do you have anyone to sit with at lunch?" Tommy pushed food around his plate without eating. "Not really. Most kids think I'm weird." Robert's heart clenched. "Why do they think that?" "Because I can't run fast, and I need help sometimes, and I think about things differently than they do." Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Some kids call me Robot Boy because of my leg braces and the way I walk." The casual way Tommy said it made it even worse. This wasn't a recent development. This was something his son had been living with for so long that he'd accepted it as normal. "Tommy, there's nothing wrong with thinking differently," Robert said, echoing David's words from earlier. "Some of the most successful people in the world think differently than everyone else." "That's what David said too," Tommy replied, looking up at his father with surprise. "You really think that's true?" "I know it's true," Robert said firmly. "And I'm sorry I haven't been paying enough attention to help you see that." They talked for another hour, the longest real conversation they'd had in months. Tommy told him about teachers who didn't understand his needs, about feeling left out during recess, about wishing he had just one friend who didn't see him as broken or different. With each revelation, Robert felt the weight of his own failures, as a father settling heavier on his shoulders. That night, after Tommy went to bed, Robert found himself standing in the game room, looking at the completed puzzle. He pulled out his phone and called David. "Mr. Whitmore?" David answered, sounding surprised. "Is everything okay?" "I've been thinking about our conversation today," Robert said. "You mentioned wanting to help Tommy. I'd like to hear more about what you had in mind." There was a pause. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel like I'm overstepping." "David, in 3 hours, you and your son gave Tommy more confidence and happiness than I've managed to give him in 3 months. I clearly need help here." Robert could hear David's relief through the phone. "Tommy is a remarkable kid, Mr. Whitmore. He's intelligent, creative, and has a natural curiosity about the world. He just needs someone who understands how his mind works and can help him build on his strengths instead of focusing on his limitations." "What are you proposing?" "Well," David said carefully, "what if I spent some time with Tommy after school, not as your groundskeeper, but as someone who could help him with homework, work on projects that interest him, maybe teach him some social skills that would help him connect better with other kids?" Robert was quiet for a moment, processing the idea. "You mean like a tutor?" "More than that, like a mentor, I guess. Someone who could help bridge the gap between what Tommy needs and what the regular school system is providing." "David, I can't ask you to take on more work when you're already juggling 3 jobs." "You wouldn't be asking," David said. "I'm offering. And honestly, if you were willing to pay me for those hours, I might be able to cut back on one of my other jobs and spend more time with Helen during her treatments." Robert felt something click into place. This could help everyone. Tommy would get the support and understanding he desperately needed. David could reduce his work stress while his wife was sick, and Robert might finally have a path to becoming the father Tommy deserved. "What would you need from me?" Robert asked. "Time," David said simply. "Time to really get to know Tommy's strengths and challenges. Time to observe how he learns best. And maybe most importantly, time for you to be involved in the process. I can help Tommy, but what he really needs is a father who understands and believes in him." The words stung, but Robert knew they were fair. "You're right. I've been so focused on providing for him financially that I forgot he needs more than just money." "It's not too late," David said gently. "Kids are resilient, and Tommy clearly loves you. He talks about wanting to make you proud." "He already makes me proud," Robert said, and realized he'd never actually told Tommy that. "I just haven't been very good at showing it." They spent the next 30 minutes working out details. David would come by every day after school to work with Tommy for 2 hours. They'd focus on homework first, but also spend time on projects that interested Tommy, like learning to use his telescope properly. David would also help Tommy prepare for social situations and build confidence in his abilities. The next morning, Robert did something he hadn't done in months. He sat down with Tommy at breakfast and really talked to him. "Tommy, I've been thinking about our conversation last night," Robert said. "How would you feel if David came by after school each day to help you with homework and work on some fun projects?" Tommy's eyes lit up immediately. "Really? And Kevin could come too sometimes?" "I think that could be arranged," Robert smiled. "David used to be a teacher, you know. He's really good at helping kids learn things in ways that make sense to them." "Dad," Tommy said quietly, "are you going to be around more too? I mean, not just for dinner, but to actually do stuff together?" The question broke Robert's heart and filled it with hope at the same time. "Yes, son. I'm going to make sure of it." That afternoon, when David arrived with Kevin in tow, Robert stayed home from the office. He watched as David patiently helped. Tommy set up his telescope, explaining each step clearly and giving Tommy time to process the information. He observed how Kevin naturally included Tommy in their games, never making him feel limited by his disabilities. But most importantly, Robert began to see his son through new eyes, not as a child defined by his challenges, but as a bright, curious, capable boy who just needed the right kind of support to flourish. The transformation had begun, and for the first time in months, Robert felt genuinely hopeful about the future. 3 weeks into their new arrangement, Robert came home from work to find something that stopped him in his tracks. Tommy and Kevin were in the backyard, but they weren't alone. 3 other children from Tommy's school were there too. 2 girls and another boy, all gathered around the telescope that had finally been properly set up on the patio. "Look through here, Amy," Tommy was saying confidently to one of the girls. "You have to close one eye and adjust this knob slowly until you can see the moon clearly." The girl peered through the telescope and gasped. "Oh, wow! I can see all the craters. Tommy, this is so cool." Robert watched from the kitchen window as his son helped each child take turns with the telescope, patiently explaining what they were seeing. This was the same boy who 3 weeks ago had eaten lunch alone every day at school. David appeared beside Robert at the window. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" "How did this happen?" Robert asked, still watching in amazement. Tommy asked if he could invite some classmates over to show them his telescope, David explained. "Turns out, when kids see Tommy in his own environment doing something he's passionate about and good at, they start to see him differently." "But these are the same kids who used to tease him," Robert said. "Kids aren't naturally cruel, Mr. Whitmore. They just don't know how to handle differences when they don't understand them." Once they saw that Tommy wasn't weird or slow, just different, they became curious instead of scared. Robert continued watching as Tommy demonstrated how to track the movement of planets across the sky. The other children hung on his every word, asking questions and genuinely impressed by his knowledge. "There's something else," David said quietly. "Tommy's teacher called me today. She wanted to know what had changed. Tommy's been participating more in class, his grades have improved, and he even volunteered to do a presentation about astronomy for the science fair." Robert felt a surge of pride mixed with regret. All those months he'd worried about Tommy falling behind, about his disabilities holding him back from academic success. But Tommy had never needed to be fixed or changed. He'd just needed someone to believe in his abilities and help him find ways to shine. "I can't believe the difference. In just 3 weeks," Robert said. "Children are incredibly resilient when they feel supported and understood," David replied. "Tommy was always this smart and capable. He just needed the right environment to show it." That evening, after Tommy's friends had gone home, the 3 of them, Robert, Tommy, and David, sat on the patio talking about the day. Kevin had gone inside to call his mother at the hospital, something he did every evening at 7 o'clock sharp. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Tommy said, looking more serious than usual. "Of course, son. Why didn't we ever do stuff like this before? You know, have friends over and show them cool things?" The question was innocent, but it cut deep. Robert took a moment to think about his answer, wanting to be honest without making Tommy feel responsible for their past distance. "I think I was scared," Robert said finally. "After your mom and I got divorced, I was so worried about making sure you had everything you needed, good doctors, therapy, the right equipment, that I forgot you also needed friends and fun and chances to show how amazing you are." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think you didn't want to spend time with me because I was too much trouble." Robert's heart nearly broke. "Tommy, you are never too much trouble. You're the best thing in my life, and I'm sorry I didn't do a better job showing you that." "It's okay, Dad," Tommy said with the kind of forgiveness that only children can offer so easily. "David says people can learn to be better at anything if they practice. Maybe you just needed to practice being around me more." David smiled at this simple wisdom. Tommy's right. Relationships are like any other skill. The more time and effort you put in, the better you get at them. 2 weeks later, Robert faced his biggest test yet. His ex-wife, Linda, called to say she was concerned about the new arrangement with David. She'd heard from mutual friends that Robert had some gardener spending time with Tommy every day. "I don't think it's appropriate," Linda said during their phone conversation. "We don't really know this man's background. What if he has ulterior motives?" "Linda, David has been working for me for 2 years," Robert replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "He's been completely trustworthy, and he's having an incredibly positive impact on Tommy. But he's just the help, Robert. Tommy should be spending time with professionals, therapists, tutors with proper credentials, not some landscaper who brings his own child to work." Robert felt his anger rising, but he also realized something important. 6 weeks ago, he might have agreed with Linda. He might have seen David the same way, as just the help, rather than as a skilled educator and caring mentor who happened to work with his hands to support his family. "David has a master's degree in special education," Robert said firmly. "He's probably more qualified to work with Tommy than most of the expensive specialists we've hired over the years. Robert, I'm worried that you're not thinking clearly about this situation. I'm considering asking for a modification to our custody arrangement." The threat hung in the air between them. Linda could make things difficult if she wanted to. She still had partial custody rights, and a judge might side with her concerns about Tommy spending time with household staff. "What do you want, Linda?" Robert asked. "I want to meet this David myself. I want to see what's really going on. If I'm not comfortable with the situation, I expect you to end this arrangement immediately." Robert's first instinct was to refuse, to fight her demands. But then he thought about Tommy's progress, about the confidence his son was building, about the friendships he was developing. If Linda could see what Robert had seen, Tommy's transformation, David's genuine care, the positive changes in their family, maybe she'd understand. "Fine," Robert said. "Come over this Saturday afternoon. You can observe everything for yourself." Saturday arrived with Robert feeling nervous for the first time in weeks. He'd told David about Linda's concerns, and they'd agreed to just proceed, normally letting their work speak for itself. When Linda arrived, Robert was surprised by how different she looked. She seemed tired, stressed, and somehow smaller than he remembered. The confident woman who'd left him for a new career and a new life appeared to be struggling more than she'd let on. "Where's Tommy?" she asked immediately. "In the backyard with David and Kevin," Robert said. "They're working on a project for the science fair." They walked through the house to the patio doors, where Linda stopped short. In the backyard, Tommy was presenting his completed science fair project, a detailed model of the solar system that he and Kevin had built together. But he wasn't presenting to just David and Kevin. The same group of school friends from a few weeks earlier had returned, along with 2 parents who'd stayed to watch. "This is Saturn," Tommy was explaining, pointing to his carefully painted model. "It's made mostly of gas, which is why it's so light that it would actually float if you could find a bathtub big enough to hold it." The children laughed, and one of the parents nodded approvingly. "That's fascinating, Tommy. How did you learn so much about planets?" "David taught me," Tommy said proudly. "He used to be a teacher before he became our gardener. He's really good at explaining things so they make sense." Linda watched her son command the attention of his audience, saw the genuine interest and respect in the other children's faces, observed the easy way Tommy moved between the different parts of his presentation. This wasn't the same quiet, withdrawn boy she'd seen during her last few visits. After the presentation ended and the visitors had left, Linda approached David directly. "I understand you're working with my son," she said, her tone neutral but not hostile. "Yes, ma'am," David replied respectfully. "Tommy's a remarkable kid. It's been a privilege to work with him." "What exactly are your qualifications for this kind of work?" David answered her questions patiently, explaining his educational background, his experience as a special education teacher, and his approach to working with children who learn differently. He spoke about Tommy specifically, detailing the progress he'd observed and the strategies that seemed to work best for him. As Linda listened, Robert saw something change in her expression. The suspicion was gradually being replaced by something that looked like relief. Later, after Tommy had gone inside to work on homework, Linda pulled Robert aside. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I was wrong about David, and I was wrong about a lot of things. What do you mean? Linda sighed deeply. The truth is, I've been struggling since the divorce. My new job is demanding, my apartment is expensive, and every time I see Tommy, I feel guilty about how much I've missed while trying to rebuild my life. When I heard about David, I think I was jealous that someone else was giving Tommy what I hadn't been able to provide. Robert felt a surge of understanding. Linda, Tommy needs both of us. The divorce was hard on everyone, but we don't have to keep making the same mistakes. I can see how happy he is, Linda said, looking through the window at Tommy, who was animatedly telling David about something he'd learned in school. I haven't seen him like this in over a year. Whatever you and David are doing, it's working. 6 months later, Robert stood in the same backyard, but everything had changed. It was Tommy's 13th birthday party, and the yard was full of children, parents, and neighbors. Tommy moved easily among his guests, no longer the isolated child he'd been just months earlier. David's wife, Helen, was there too, her cancer treatments having been successful. She and Linda had become unlikely friends, bonding over their shared experiences as mothers trying to balance career and family pressures. Kevin and Tommy remained inseparable, their friendship having grown into something that inspired other children to look beyond surface differences. The telescope was set up in its permanent spot, and Tommy regularly hosted star parties for anyone interested in learning about astronomy. But perhaps most remarkably, Robert had discovered that his greatest success wasn't measured in business profits or material possessions. It was measured in his son's laughter, in the confidence Tommy showed when talking about his interests, and in the knowledge that he'd finally learned how to be the father Tommy had always needed him to be. As he watched Tommy confidently explain the phases of the moon to a group of fascinated friends, Robert realized that David had been right from the beginning. Sometimes the most valuable things in life come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people we overlook are exactly the ones we need most.